The voice on the other end did not answer right away, and Elena could hear the faint rustle of movement, like someone shifting in their seat, weighing whether the question deserved a real response or a polite dismissal. Then, finally, the man spoke, his tone slower now, more careful. If it is structured correctly, no? Not until it is already happening. Elena did not interrupt. She stood still by the table, the phone pressed gently to her ear, her eyes fixed on the flash drive resting where she had left it. "Why are you asking?" he added, a trace of suspicion threading through the question. Elena exhaled quietly, choosing her words with precision. "Because I think someone signed something they did not fully understand," she said. Another pause followed, longer this time, stretching thin like a wire pulled too tight. "Who?" he asked. Elena's gaze did not shift. "That does not matter yet," she replied softly. "What matters is whether there is still time to stop it." On the other end, a faint sound, almost like a breath held and then released. "If the documents are already executed, reversing it is not simple," he said. "But if you have proof of intent, proof that the structure was misleading, then it changes things." Elena's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. Proof. She had more than suspicion now. She had the video, the documents, the pattern. "What kind of proof?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would not be simple. "Something that shows awareness," he replied. "Something that proves the other party knew exactly what they were doing." Elena's eyes flicked briefly to the laptop, to the frozen image she could still picture without looking. The second voice, the careful wording, the certainty behind it. "And if someone had that," she pressed, "then they have leverage," he said plainly. "The kind that can stop a deal, or destroy it." The words settled between them, heavy and undeniable. Destroy. Elena closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again, steadier now. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Wait," he added quickly. "Elena, if you are involved in something like this, you need to be careful. People do not structure deals like that by accident." She did not respond right away. Instead, she let the silence speak for her, then ended the call with a soft tap of her thumb. The room returned to stillness, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet. It was sharper now, more defined, like everything had edges where before it had none. Elena set the phone down and reached for the flash drive again, holding it between her fingers as she walked back to the table. She plugged it in once more, the soft click barely audible, and opened the video again. This time, she watched differently, not as someone trying to understand, but as someone looking for what mattered. She replayed the moment where the second voice spoke about the transfer, slowing it down, listening to each word, each pause, each shift in tone. There, a slight hesitation before the confirmation, a glance toward the tablet. Awareness. Not accidental, not careless, intentional. Elena paused the video and leaned back, her mind moving quickly now, connecting pieces that had been scattered before. She could see it clearly. The structure, the trap, the outcome, and the man at the center of it, standing in a room filled with certainty, unaware that he was already positioned to take the fall. Her gaze drifted to the window again, where the city lights had fully taken over the darkness, small points of brightness scattered across the distance. Somewhere out there, Daniel Whitmore was still moving forward, still believing the version of reality that had been built around him. Elena's grip on the flash drive tightened just slightly, then relaxed, because now she understood something he did not. Control was not about who had the most power. It was about who saw the truth first. And for the first time since she walked out of that house, Elena was no longer reacting to what had happened. She was preparing for what came next. The night deepened around her, but Elena did not turn on any additional lights. The single bulb above the table cast a steady glow, leaving the corners of the apartment in soft shadow, as if the room itself understood that clarity was only needed in certain places. She leaned forward again, her elbows resting lightly on the table, eyes fixed on the laptop screen where the paused frame waited. Then, with a slow breath, she reached for her phone once more, her movements deliberate, no longer uncertain. This time, she did not scroll through contacts. She opened a blank message. The cursor blinked, patient, expectant. Elena stared at it for a moment, her mind assembling the pieces not as fragments, but as a sequence. Cause, effect, consequence. She began typing. Not everything. Not yet. Just enough. A name. A question. A line that would only make sense to someone who knew where to look. She read it once, then again, her thumb hovering over the send button before pressing it. The message left instantly, disappearing into a network she could not see, but now trusted to carry weight beyond her small apartment. She set the phone down beside the laptop and reached for the flash drive again, this time plugging it into a second port, creating a duplicate file on her system. Progress bar. Slow. Measured. She watched it carefully, not out of fear, but out of intention. When it finished, she ejected the original drive and placed it on the table, then slid the copy into a small envelope she pulled from a drawer. The paper felt thin in her hands, almost too fragile for what it held. Across the city, inside a glass tower that reflected nothing but itself, Daniel Whitmore stood in a conference room filled with quiet confidence. The deal was moving forward. Numbers aligned. Signatures already in place. Around him, advisors spoke in calm, precise tones, their words layered with certainty. He nodded at the right moments, his expression composed, controlled, the same way it had been earlier that day. Nothing in the room suggested doubt. Nothing hinted at the shift already beginning beyond their view. Back in the apartment, Elena sealed the envelope with a firm press of her fingers, smoothing the edge as if sealing more than just paper. She wrote a name on the front, slow and steady, her handwriting careful, each letter deliberate. Then she set it aside and returned her attention to the laptop once more. This time, she opened the video again, but instead of watching it through, she paused at specific moments, capturing still frames, zooming in slightly, isolating details that could not be dismissed. A glance, a timestamp, a confirmation screen that lingered just long enough to matter. She saved each one, organizing them quietly, methodically, building something stronger than a single piece of evidence. She was building a narrative, a sequence no one could ignore once it was seen clearly. Her phone vibrated again, softer this time, and she picked it up, reading the response that had already come through. It was short, just one line. Where did you get this? Elena did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the message, then at the files on her screen, then at the envelope resting beside her. She understood now that this was no longer about being right or wrong. It was about timing, about when the truth entered the room. She placed the phone down again without replying and leaned back in her chair, her gaze lifting toward the ceiling where no camera blinked, no silent red light marked observation. Here, there was no one watching, no one controlling the frame. And yet, for the first time, she felt something close to control. Because somewhere, beyond the quiet walls of her apartment, the first thread had already been pulled. And the man who believed he had removed her from the equation had not realized she had already placed herself at the center of what was coming next. Morning arrived quietly, not with noise but with light, thin and pale, slipping through the edges of the blinds and stretching across the table where everything had been left exactly as it was. Elena was already awake. She had not slept much, but it did not show in her posture. She stood by the window, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in her hand, her eyes focused not on the street below, but on something further, something internal, like she was aligning pieces that had already fallen into place. The envelope still rested on the table, sealed, addressed, waiting. The laptop sat beside it, closed now, but not forgotten. Nothing about this felt rushed. That was the difference. She was no longer reacting. She was timing. Her phone buzzed softly against the surface of the table, and she turned, setting the cup down without taking a sip. A new message. Same number. She opened it. We need to talk. In person. Elena read it once, then again, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper now, more focused. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she walked back to the table and picked up the envelope, weighing it lightly in her hand, as if confirming its presence, its reality. Then she reached for her phone and typed a reply. Public place. Noon. She sent it without hesitation. Across the city, the glass tower reflected the morning sun in sharp angles, turning its surface into something almost blinding. Inside, Daniel Whitmore stood at the head of a long conference table, one hand resting against the polished surface, the other holding a tablet that displayed numbers moving in quiet precision. The room was filled, but controlled. Voices low, confident, everything proceeding exactly as expected. We are aligned for final execution, one of the advisors said, tapping a document with a measured gesture. All parties have confirmed. Daniel nodded once, his expression composed, unreadable, the same calm certainty that had carried him through every decision before this one. There was no hesitation in the room, no visible doubt. But then, a slight shift. A phone vibrating against the table. Not his. Someone else's. A brief glance. A subtle change in posture. It passed quickly, almost unnoticed, but it was there. The kind of small disruption that meant something had entered the room that had not been planned. Back in the apartment, Elena moved with quiet purpose. She placed the envelope into her bag, then reached for the flash drive, holding it for a moment before slipping it into a separate pocket, away from everything else. Not hidden, just distinct. She checked her phone again. The time. Still early. Enough space to prepare. She walked into the small bedroom and returned with a clean jacket, simple, neutral, the kind that did not draw attention but carried presence. She put it on slowly, smoothing the sleeves with deliberate care. Every movement had intention now, every step measured. She paused once more by the table, her gaze drifting briefly to the laptop, then away. She did not need to open it again. She already knew what it held. The truth had moved beyond the screen. It was already in motion. Outside, the city had fully woken, traffic building, voices rising, the rhythm of the day taking shape. Elena stepped out of the apartment and closed the door behind her with a soft click, the sound final but not heavy. As she walked down the stairs, her footsteps echoed lightly, steady, unhurried. Because somewhere, in a room filled with polished confidence, a man was still moving forward, unaware that the timeline he believed in was no longer his to control. And in a few hours, when the truth finally entered the room, it would not arrive loudly. It would arrive, the way it always did. Quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore. The cafe was already half full by the time Elena arrived, the low murmur of conversations blending with the steady rhythm of cups being set down and chairs shifting against the floor. It was the kind of place where no one looked too closely at anyone else, where people came to disappear into their own thoughts while sitting inches away from strangers. Elena stepped inside and paused just long enough to take in the room, her eyes moving calmly across the space, noting exits, corners, reflections in the glass. Then she chose a table near the window, not too close to the door, not too hidden. Balanced. She sat down, placing her bag gently at her feet, her posture straight but relaxed, her hands resting lightly on the table as if she had been there longer than she had. The envelope remained inside the bag, untouched for now, but present in her awareness like a quiet anchor. Minutes passed. The light shifted slightly across the floor, and the door opened again with a soft chime. Elena did not turn immediately. She did not need to. She felt the change in the room, subtle but clear, like a new presence adjusting the air without speaking. Then footsteps approached, measured, controlled. A chair across from her pulled back. "You chose a public place," the man said, his voice lower in person, less filtered than over the phone, but still careful. Elena lifted her gaze then, meeting his eyes for the first time. Mid-40s. Sharp suit. The kind of person who noticed details because he had learned they mattered. "You asked to talk," she replied simply. He sat down, placing his phone face down on the table, his attention fixed on her in a way that was both direct and restrained. "You sent me something last night," he said. Not a question. A statement. Elena nodded once. "I did." A brief pause. The sounds of the cafe continued around them, but at their table, everything felt contained, quieter, like the space between them had narrowed into something precise. "Where did you get it?" he asked. Elena did not answer right away. Instead, she reached down slowly and pulled the envelope from her bag, placing it on the table between them without sliding it forward yet. The paper lay flat, simple, unmarked except for the name written across it. The man's eyes dropped to it, then back to her. "That matters less than what it shows," she said calmly. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in focus. "Do you understand what you are holding?" he asked. Elena's expression did not change. "Yes," she said. "Do you?" That landed differently. He leaned back, just a fraction, studying her now, not dismissing, not underestimating. "Not anymore. If this is real," he said slowly, "it changes everything." Elena's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the envelope, steady, controlled. "It is real," she replied. A silence followed, but it was not empty. It was the kind that carried weight, the kind that meant both of them understood the shift that had already begun. Outside, a car passed, its reflection sliding across the window beside them. Inside, the man reached forward and placed his hand on the envelope, but did not open it yet. "Why bring this to me?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Elena held his gaze, her answer simple, direct. "Because someone needs to see it before it is too late." The man exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening slightly against the paper. Then, finally, he opened it. Inside, the copies. The frames. The evidence arranged in silence, but speaking clearly enough. His eyes moved quickly at first, then slower, more deliberate, as the realization settled in. The room around them did not change, but something inside the moment did. A shift. A recalculation. He looked up at her again, no longer questioning whether it mattered. Only how much. "You are aware," he said carefully, "that if this goes forward, there will be consequences." Elena nodded once. "I am." Another pause. Then, softer, but more certain than anything he had said before, he added, "Not just for him." Elena did not look away. "I know," she said. And in that moment, the balance that had once been entirely out of her hands began to tilt. The man did not speak for several seconds after reading the last page, his eyes still fixed on the documents, as if looking away too soon might change what they meant. Around them, the cafe continued its quiet rhythm, cups clinking softly, a door opening and closing, someone laughing in the distance, but none of it reached the space between them. He placed the papers back into the envelope with deliberate care, aligning the edges before resting his hand on top of it again. "This was not meant to be found," he said finally, his voice lower now, more grounded in something real. Elena watched him without interruption, her posture unchanged, her hands still resting lightly on the table. "No," she replied. "It was not." He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, his gaze shifting briefly toward the window before returning to her. The calculation in his expression was no longer subtle. It was active. "You understand what happens if this goes public," he said. "Not a warning. Not entirely. More like a boundary being drawn in real time." Elena nodded once, her response steady. "Yes." A pause. Then she added, quieter, but with more weight. "That is why I came to you first." That changed something. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else in the room. But at their table, the shift was clear. He studied her again, longer this time, not just assessing the information, but the intention behind it. "You are not trying to expose him," he said slowly. Elena did not look away. "I am trying to stop what happens next," she answered. The distinction settled between them, precise and important. He tapped his fingers once against the envelope, a small, controlled movement that suggested his thoughts were moving faster than his words. "If this deal goes through," he said, "and the structure holds the way it is written, his company takes the liability. Full exposure. Financial, legal, all of it." Elena nodded again. "I know. And you believe he does not see it." "I know he does not," she corrected gently. Another silence followed, but this one was different. Less uncertain. More focused. The man reached for his phone, flipping it over and glancing at the screen, then placing it back down without unlocking it. "There is still a window," he said after a moment. "Small, but it exists." Elena's eyes remained on him, attentive but calm. "What kind of window?" she asked. "Enough time to pause execution," he replied. "Enough time to force a review. But only if the right pressure is applied." He slid the envelope slightly toward himself now, not taking it away, but claiming its presence more directly. "This," he added, tapping it once, "is not just evidence. It is leverage." Elena's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table, then relaxed again. "I am not interested in leverage," she said quietly. "I am interested in stopping it." He held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Then you are going to need to let me use it," he said. The words were direct, but not forceful. A statement of necessity, not control. Elena considered that, her eyes drifting briefly to the envelope, then back to him. She understood what he meant. Understood what it would require. "If you do," she said slowly, "it stops the deal. Not just delays it." He did not hesitate this time. "If I do this correctly," he replied, "it does more than stop it. It exposes the structure before it can collapse on him." Elena's expression shifted slightly, not into relief, but into something closer to resolution. That was the outcome she had been working toward, even before she had fully named it. He reached for the envelope again, this time lifting it from the table, holding it firmly now. I will need to move quickly, he said. Once this starts, it does not stay quiet. Elena nodded once. I understand. He stood then, smoothing his jacket with a practiced motion, his posture returning to something more public, more controlled. But before stepping away, he paused, looking down at her with a different kind of focus than before. You could have used this differently, he said. You could have walked away with it. Sold it. Protected yourself. Elena met his gaze without hesitation. That was never the point, she replied. He held her eyes for a second longer, then gave a small nod, something like acknowledgement passing between them before he turned and walked away, the envelope in his hand, already becoming part of something larger than either of them individually. Elena remained seated for a moment after he left, her hands still, her breathing even. The cafe noise returned slowly, filling the space he had occupied. She reached for her bag, lifting it from the floor, her movements calm, unhurried. Because now, the decision had been made. And somewhere, in a room where everything still looked under control, the first real crack in that certainty had already begun. The city did not slow down when the shift began. It never did. Cars moved through intersections, people crossed streets with their heads down, conversations continued. In offices and hallways, all of it unaware that somewhere within that motion, a single decision had already begun to change the direction of something much larger. Elena stepped out of the cafe and into the daylight, the door closing softly behind her, sealing in the quiet conversation that had just taken place. The air outside felt sharper now, brighter, as if everything had edges she had not noticed before. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and began walking, her pace steady, her posture unchanged. There was no urgency in her movement, no outward sign that anything had shifted. But inside, something had settled. Not relief. Not yet. More like alignment. Across the city, inside the glass tower, the conference room no longer felt as certain as it had an hour earlier. The same table. The same people. The same documents spread neatly across its surface. But the rhythm had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying attention, but it was there. A pause where there should have been immediate agreement. A question asked twice instead of once. A glance exchanged between two advisors that lasted just a second too long. Daniel Whitmore stood at the head of the table, his expression still composed, his posture unchanged, but something in his eyes had sharpened, as if he was beginning to sense the shift without yet understanding its source. We need to confirm the liability allocation again, one of the advisors said, his tone measured but no longer entirely confident. Daniel's gaze moved to him, steady. It has already been reviewed, he replied. Then we should have no issue reviewing it again, the advisor answered, just as calmly. The room held that moment, suspended, the air tightening just slightly. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for the document, flipping through the pages with controlled precision, his movements exact, deliberate. The paper made a soft, dry sound as it turned. Somewhere in the process, something did not align. It was not obvious. Not at first. But it was enough. His hand paused. Just for a second. Across from him, another advisor shifted in his seat, clearing his throat quietly. There have been concerns raised, he added carefully. Daniel's eyes lifted from the page, moving from one face to another, reading the room in a way he had done countless times before. But this time, the pattern was different. This time, the confidence was not shared. Back on the street, Elena reached the corner and stopped at the crosswalk, the signal counting down in bright red numbers. She stood among a small group of strangers, none of them aware of her, none of them aware of what had already begun to move through the systems they trusted. The light changed. She stepped forward with the others, her movement blending seamlessly into the flow. Across the intersection, a large screen displayed financial news and scrolling text, numbers updating in real time, small shifts that meant everything to the right people. She did not look at it. She did not need to. Inside the tower, Daniel set the document down slowly, his fingers resting against the edge of the table. What concerns? He asked, his voice still calm, but lower now, more focused. The advisor hesitated, then spoke. The structure may not protect us the way we initially believed. The words landed quietly, but they did not dissipate. They stayed. Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to register. "Explain," he said. And for the first time since the deal had begun, the room did not move forward. It paused. Elena reached the other side of the street and continued walking, her steps even, her gaze forward. She did not look back. She did not need to see it to know it was happening. Because the truth did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It arrived the way it always did. Quietly. Precisely. And once it was seen, it could not be unseen. The explanation did not come all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, like someone carefully pulling a thread they had only just realized was loose. The advisor reached for the document, turning it slightly so it faced the center of the table, his finger tracing a line buried deep within the text. "This clause," he said, his voice controlled but no longer certain. "It redirects all downstream liability under specific breach conditions." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention narrowing, his eyes scanning the line with precision. "That was part of the negotiated protection," he replied. "Only under defined scenarios." "Yes," the advisor said, "but the definitions are broader than we initially understood." A quiet shift moved through the room, not visible in any single movement, but present in the way everyone seemed to hold their breath just a fraction longer. Daniel's hand rested against the table, fingers still, his gaze fixed on the document as if willing it to align with what he expected. "Clarify," he said, his voice lower now, more focused. The advisor swallowed subtly before continuing. "If any irregularity is detected post-execution, even outside our direct control, the responsibility consolidates here." He tapped the page lightly. "With us." The words settled into the room without resistance. They did not need emphasis. Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly, his posture still composed, but no longer effortless. He flipped back a page, then forward again, scanning, recalculating, searching for something that would contradict what he was hearing. But the structure held. Clean. Precise. And suddenly, unmistakable. Across the table, another advisor spoke, quieter now. "We missed it because it is written to look standard." Daniel's eyes lifted from the page, moving across the room, reading faces that were no longer aligned with him. Not hostile. Not yet. But no longer certain. "Who flagged this?" he asked. A brief hesitation followed, the kind that meant the answer mattered more than the question. "It came through external review." The first advisor replied carefully. "Anonymous source." That word lingered longer than the others. "Anonymous." Daniel leaned back slowly, the chair making a faint sound against the floor, his gaze drifting for a moment toward the glass wall that overlooked the city below. Everything out there continued exactly as it had before. Cars moving, people walking, light reflecting off buildings in perfect, indifferent patterns. Nothing in that view suggested that anything had changed. And yet, everything had. Back on the street, Elena walked past a row of storefronts, her reflection appearing briefly in each window before disappearing again, fragmented, shifting, but always moving forward. Her phone remained silent now, but she did not check it. She did not need confirmation. She could feel it in the air, in the timing, in the way the day had unfolded without resistance. Inside the conference room, Daniel's fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the table, a subtle shift in pressure, the only visible sign that something had broken through the certainty he had held on to. "Stop execution," he said finally. The words were calm, controlled, but they carried weight now, not just authority. Recognition. The room responded immediately, movement returning, voices. Low but urgent, documents being gathered, screens being updated, the flow reversing direction. But the silence that followed his words did not disappear. It stayed, quieter now, deeper, settling into something that could not be undone. Elena turned the corner and slowed slightly as she passed a clinic entrance, the glass doors reflecting the sky above in a soft, shifting blue. She paused for just a second, her eyes resting on the reflection, then moved on without stopping. Because what needed to be done was already in motion, and somewhere behind her, in a room filled with polished certainty that had finally cracked, a man who believed he controlled the outcome was beginning to understand something far more difficult to accept. He had not lost control in a moment of chaos. He had lost it in silence, long before he ever realized someone was watching. The conference room did not return to what it had been, even as the movement resumed and voices filled the space again. Something had shifted too deeply for that. Papers were gathered, screens updated, instructions given in low, controlled tones, but beneath it all there was a new layer, one that had not been there before. Awareness. Daniel remained standing at the head of the table, his posture still straight, his expression composed, but no longer untouched. His gaze rested on the document in front of him, not reading it now, but seeing it differently. The same words, the same structure, but no longer invisible. Who reviewed this externally? He asked, his voice calm, but carrying a sharper edge than before. One of the advisors hesitated before answering. The source did not identify themselves, he said. It came through a secure channel. The analysis was precise. Daniel's fingers pressed lightly against the surface of the table, the subtle pressure the only sign of tension. And we accepted it without verification? Another pause. The information aligned with the document. The advisor replied carefully. There was no reason to question the accuracy. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, his reflection catching in the glass wall beside him, layered over the city beyond. For a moment, he just looked at it, as if measuring the distance between what he believed and what had been revealed. Find out who sent it, he said finally. The instruction was simple, but it carried weight. The kind that meant it would not be ignored. Yes, came the quiet response. Across the city, Elena stepped into the clinic lobby, the glass doors closing softly behind her, sealing out the noise of the street. The air inside was cooler, quieter, filled with the faint scent of antiseptic and something softer beneath it, something human. She approached the front desk, her steps steady, her voice calm as she gave her name. The receptionist nodded, typing quickly, then gestured toward a row of chairs along the wall. Elena thanked her and moved to sit, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her bag placed carefully beside her. Around her, people waited in silence or soft conversation, each carrying something unseen, something that mattered only within their own world. Elena sat among them, not separate, not different, just present. Her phone buzzed once in her bag, a brief vibration that she felt more than heard. She did not reach for it immediately. Instead, she let the moment settle, her eyes drifting to the window where sunlight filtered through in soft, diffused patterns. For the first time since the day had begun, there was a pause that belonged entirely to her. Not to the deal, not to the evidence, not to the man who had dismissed her without a second thought, just to her. After a moment, she reached into her bag and pulled out the phone, her gaze steady as she looked at the screen. A new message. Unknown number. She opened it. We need to meet. Today. No name. No explanation. Elena read it once, her expression unchanged, then locked the screen and slipped the phone back into her bag. She did not respond. Not yet. Across the city, Daniel stepped out of the conference room, the door closing behind him with a soft, final sound that echoed slightly in the quiet hallway. The noise of the meeting faded instantly, replaced by a different kind of silence, one that felt less controlled, more honest. He walked down the corridor slowly, his steps measured, his mind moving through the sequence again, not as it had been presented, but as it truly was. The clause, the structure, the moment it had been missed, and the moment it had been revealed. He stopped near the end of the hallway, his gaze resting briefly on a reflective surface, catching his own image in passing. For a second, he did not look like a man in control. He looked like someone recalculating. Somewhere in that process, a realization began to form, not fully shaped yet, but present. This had not been luck. This had not been chance. Someone had seen it. Someone had understood it. And someone had chosen to act before it was too late. Back in the clinic, Elena's name was called softly from across the room. She stood, her movements calm, her posture steady, and walked toward the voice without hesitation. Because while the world outside continued to shift and adjust to a truth it had not expected, she was already moving forward into something else entirely. Something quieter, something personal, and far more important than anything she had left behind. The hallway inside the clinic was quieter than the lobby, the sounds of the outside world fading into something distant, softened by walls that carried a different kind of purpose. Elena followed the nurse down the corridor, her steps light, her gaze steady, taking in the small details without thinking about them. The The muted colors, the faint hum of equipment behind closed doors, the way the air felt still but not heavy. They stopped at a door halfway down, and the nurse turned slightly, offering a small, reassuring nod before opening it. "You can go in," she said gently. Elena nodded in return and stepped inside. The room was simple, clean, with a single window letting in soft daylight that rested quietly across the floor. On the bed, her mother sat propped up against a pillow, thinner than before, but her eyes still warm, still present. Elena paused just for a second in the doorway, the world outside the room slipping away completely, leaving only this. Then she walked forward, her expression softening in a way it had not all day. "Hey," she said quietly. Her mother smiled, a small but genuine curve of her lips. "You are early," she replied. Elena shrugged lightly, setting her bag down by the chair. "I had some things to take care of," she said. She did not explain. She did not need to. She moved closer, sitting down beside the bed, her hand gently resting over her mother's, warm against warm. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence here was different. Not tense, not waiting, just full. After a while, her mother looked at her. More closely, her expression thoughtful. "You look different," she said softly. Elena tilted her head slightly. "Different how?" Her mother smiled faintly. "Like you made a decision," she said. Elena let out a quiet breath, her gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning. "Maybe I did," she replied. Her mother squeezed her hand gently, the gesture small but steady. "Good," she said. "Life does not wait for us to feel ready." Elena nodded, her fingers tightening slightly in return, grounding herself in the moment. Outside, somewhere far beyond the quiet walls of the clinic, phones were ringing, messages were being sent, meetings were being rescheduled. In a glass tower across the city, a man stood in his office, staring at a screen that now told a different story than it had that morning, one shaped not by control, but by interruption, by truth introduced at exactly the right time. He did not know her name. Not yet. But he knew something had changed. Back in the room, Elena adjusted the blanket slightly over her mother's lap, her movements gentle, instinctive. "The treatment starts this week," her mother said, her voice calm but searching. Elena met her eyes, steady, certain. "It will," she answered. No hesitation. No doubt. Her mother studied her for a moment, then nodded, accepting the answer without question. Because sometimes certainty did not need explanation. It just needed to be felt. Elena sat there a little longer, her hand still resting over her mother's, the quiet between them no longer filled with uncertainty, but with something warmer, something steady. She did not check her phone. She did not think about the messages waiting or the conversations unfolding elsewhere. Those things were already in motion, already beyond the point where they needed her constant attention. For now, this was enough. And somewhere, in a place built on power and perception, a man who had once looked past her without a second thought would soon begin to understand something he had never considered before. That the person he dismissed as invisible had not only seen everything, she had chosen what to do with it. And in the end, that choice had not been about power. It had been about something far quieter, something far stronger. She did not change the world. She changed one outcome, and that was enough.